Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
I think success is really measured in the long term. When I will know I'm successful is down the road. It's in 5, 7, 10, 20 years. Looking at my children's lives, are they happy? Are they healthy? Are they living a life that they want to live? That will tell me if I was successful.
Hello and welcome to Measuring Success Right. I'm today's host, Grant Frazier. For today's episode, I spoke with Professor Kevin Shafer, a sociology professor at BYU. His research focuses on family dynamics, fatherhood involvement, and mental health in the United States and Canada, and he's authored over 40 peer-reviewed articles relating to this topic. But he doesn't just write academic articles. He's written for the Deseret News, The Conversation, CBC, and the New York Times, among others, just about his research. This might seem a little bit outside of our theme as a business podcast, but I think you'll be surprised at how much it ties in. The ways that our family relationships are affected by our work, the way that stress impacts our ability to be present for our children. All of these are things that are important to consider as we look at measuring success in our own life. So without further ado, I think you're all going to really like this episode. Enjoy. Okay, Kevin Shafer, thank you so much for coming on to Measuring Success Right.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're really excited to talk with you today about your research into fatherhood and mental health. And I wanted to start by just asking kind of high level, what drew you to focus on this for your research and what topic within it do you explore the most, like just broad overview of your research?
Sure. So I think the thing that got me interested in it the most is just honestly my own experiences as a dad. So I have four kids, and really started to do research on the topic as soon as we had our first child. So, and I recognized that there just wasn't a lot of research being done by sociologists, at least, on fathers, what their influence is on kids, what their influence is on families. So that's why I got into it. In terms of what I study, kind of a broad range of things around fatherhood. The biggest one probably is the relationship between mental health and father involvement. But I also do a lot of cross-national research now that looks at differences and similarities in father involvement from place to place, and how the places we live, the policies that exist in the places that we live, how they influence how involved dads are in the lives of their kids.
I read your paper, or I read the abstract at least of your paper about fathers' relationships, like comparing it in Canada to the United States. And I thought that was really interesting. Would you be able to just give like a little summary of kind of the findings of that research and what you did?
Sure, yeah. So Canadian dads are doing better than American dads are, is sort of the high level point. And the reason why is because there are social policies in place in Canada that are much more beneficial to father involvement than social policies that exist in the United States. And so, one sort of stat that I think sort of explains it well is in the United States, more than a third of dads work 50 hours, at least 50 hours a week.
Wow, I didn't know it was that high.
Yeah, it's a huge number, right? That number in Canada is 5%. So that's just one major difference between the two countries that are actually quite a bit alike, right? So two countries that are very similar to one another, but there is this massive difference in how involved dads are in the lives of their kids in the two countries, and so I think it gives us a sort of an aspirational tale here in the United States of some things that we can do that could increase father involvement and, as a result, gender equality in the home and at work.
Absolutely. And just kind of diving into fatherhood a little bit more and some of the work you've done. I read your Deseret News op-ed as well that talks about the role of fatherhood. And something that really stuck out to me was that you mentioned that fatherhood is often, it's a less defined role than the role of motherhood. And that was just an idea I'd never thought about before. So I'd love to just hear a bit more about that and any insight you might have as to why that is, like social factors, historical, just why is the role of father not defined? Why is it hard to have a role model for that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good and important question. So I think one reason why is that motherhood and being female are tied together much more strongly than being male and being a dad. So women and girls are socialized really from a very, very early age to be focused on being moms in a way that dads are not, or I should say boys are not socialized in that way, in the same way to become fathers, right? So things that we socialize boys to focus on are things like employment and being competitive and sports, things like that, right? Those are sort of the socializing influences in the lives of boys. Girls get a very, very different sort of socialization experience, right? Think about things like babysitting or helping siblings. Those sorts of things really are sort of directed at helping women prepare for the maternal role. So that's where it starts. And then, we have a significant issues as we move into adulthood. There are just different sets of expectations for males and females, and those expectations for males really focus on things like employment and earning money and being a good worker, and really are focused on being a mom for women. And so we really just don't have the same sort of socialization. We don't have the same institutionalization of fatherhood as we do with motherhood.
One cultural example that kind of comes to mind when you say that is like my experience just in church, like I don't think anyone intended for it, but like all the girls my age when I was younger, they would be learning about how to be a good mother, how to prepare the home. And I don't know, it's like in the church it's a little different. Maybe it's like it's aspiration towards the mission, and to like provide for a family, but it even when it's talking about family, it seems like it's framed in the lens of provide for your family and not like be a present father. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and yet, like I think there is an expectation among dads in the church to also be highly involved and engaged at home, right? We just, again, like I think you're pointing it out perfectly, right? As just one example of how that socialization differs, right? Like if you look at old manuals, there's like many lessons in young women's manuals on preparing for motherhood. There's not an analogous lesson in young men's manuals for preparing to become a dad, right? So that's changed, right? They've changed those manuals since, but sort of historically that was never the case. And so I think it just reflects sort of those expectations and values that historically have been the case in the United States, but are slowly changing. There are differences and changes over time, and so but it's going to take time for us to socialize kids in ways that tie being male and being a dad in the same way that we tie being female and being a mom.
I saw that your research, you've also focused a lot on like rates of depression among fathers and kind of what happens when a father is depressed in a home. I don't know. I was wondering if you think that this kind of ties into, I'm asking about a lot of things here, but I'm wondering if you think this ties into the idea of like the stoic suffering in silence type male that has been kind of raised up in our society, and just if you could also define like masculine norm adherence for us, for the audience, just that type of thing. Right, I just kind of want to rack your brain on this.
Sure, yeah. So masculine norm adherence, like, so when people hear this, they tend to think like, or they sometimes hear, oh, like what you're saying is masculinity is bad. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what academics are saying. What we're saying is masculinity in its most extreme forms are negative or can be negative in certain aspects of life, right? So, for example, like what you mentioned, this concept of being emotionally stoic, right? Not showing your emotions, what we might sometimes refer to as the strong silent type. That might have benefits in some places, right? Like my dad was a firefighter. I can totally imagine being the strong silent type when you're a firefighter is advantageous. But it's not really advantageous when we're talking about parenting kids, because parenting is as much a physical exercise as it is an emotional exercise, right? We are there to really provide emotional and social support to our children And, if you ask people, what are things that your parents do? And they're like, well, they provide advice. They're there for me when I need them. If I'm having a bad day, they're there to like listen to me. That's emotional work, right? That's all emotional aspects of being a parent.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine that Stoicism isn't necessarily particularly beneficial to engaging in that kind of emotional work that is part of parenting. When we talk about depression, and it's sort of interesting because we've actually looked at the relationship between masculinity and depression as well, but when we think about depression, it's sort of the same process, right? Depression is something that challenges our ability to connect with other people. It also challenges our ability to connect with our children. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why there's a relationship between depression and parenting. What we don't normally, we actually normally think of that when we think about that link, we think about moms, right? And it's sort of the first thing that immediately comes to mind is postpartum depression.
Mm-hmm.
But rates of depression in dads are also, relatively high. We're talking about one in 6, 1 in 7 dads has clinically significant levels of depression. So it's not rare by any stretch of the imagination, but very much understudied. But becomes increasingly important as dads are more and more involved in the lives of their children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as dads become increasingly involved at home and engaged at home, engaged in the lives of their kids, providing that emotional support, doing childcare, those sorts of things, the impact of father's depression is going to show up more frequently.
Let's see. I wanted to go, you touched on this a little bit in your introduction, kind of as we talked, but I was thinking about this quote you had, which says, "While great attention has been paid to the influence of mother's depression on parenting behavior and child well-being, research on the association between paternal depression and fathering practices is less developed. Although prior research has identified the importance of fathers for child well-being and development, knowledge guiding practice with fathers has failed to acknowledge the significance of fathers." And so we've talked about the fact that like research kind of hasn't looked at fathers so much, but I was wondering if you had any answer to why we haven't studied it. Like, is it something that we didn't recognize as a culture until recently, or is it some other factor? I'm just wondering if you had any insight there, because it seems like a big oversight, right?
Yeah, I think it is a big oversight. I'd say it's multi-pronged. So one is, researchers like myself are just as connected to the world as anyone else is. And
Mm-hmm.
so we come with our own biases and our own viewpoints and those sorts of things. And so, a lot of researchers, I think, made the assumption that if we're looking at the impact of parents on kids, then we should only really look at moms, because moms are the ones that are caring for kids and they're doing it, they're the ones that are spending the most time with children and all these other things. And so clearly they're going to have, the much bigger impact. In fact, dads probably don't even have any impact at all. And so let's study moms, right? And so that was like the long-standing assumption for many,
Wow.
many decades.
Huh.
So you sort of have that assumption, right? So we're just as open to sort of biases that exist in the world as anyone else. So I think that's number one. I think number two is that we researchers also have this opinion that men don't want to talk. And so they're not going to tell us what they think. They're not going to complete surveys. They're not going to do these things. Moms will do
Huh.
those things. So let's ask mom and not worry so much about dad. And the fact of the matter is that that's just not accurate, right? So I have a colleague at Wayne State University in Detroit, and she does qualitative interviews with dads, meaning, she sits down with them and asks them questions, and then they can respond in their own words, as opposed to someone like me who forces your response into like one of 5 nice, neat categories, right?
Yeah.
So, but she told me, like, in a conversation once, that she was doing a study on moms and dads, and the moms the average time that they spoke was about half an hour in their data set. For dads, it was an hour, right?
Wow.
Why was it an hour? It's because no one had ever asked them before, and they really had a lot of thoughts and feelings that they wanted to get out, they wanted to talk about. So I think it's a misnomer that men aren't going to respond to our surveys or they're not going to answer our questions, but that misnomer influences the research in really significant ways. And I think the third thing that matters is that I think there is a little bit of hesitation to do research on dads because of some of the issues that exist in families, like intimate partner violence or child abuse, which are more likely to be engaged in by fathers than it is to be engaged in by mothers. And so I think there's often maybe a little bit of a wariness that exists among researchers into studying fathers. Now, I mean, the important point here is that the vast majority of men are not abusers. That it is more common among men than it is among women to be abusive, but that doesn't mean that the majority or even a small minority of men are doing those things. So I think over time, what we've learned is the importance of dads and including dads in the research. And I think that literature is emerging over time, which is exciting.
So that's a nice segue into where I wanted to go into next, which is kind of just the idea of, I don't know if you have a specific term you use for this, but I was just thinking of like positive fatherhood, like positive present fatherhood. And I just kind of want to know what that looks like to you as you've done research on this. Like, what traits do you look for when you're trying to see how like happy a father is with their family or how well the family's doing? Like, what are the factors that can help you understand?
It's a really good question. I think positive fatherhood's a good way to frame it. So I think one is how warm they are towards their kids. Warmth usually means things like hugging, showing affection, spending time with your kids, doing activities with them, that sort of thing. A second part is emotional support, right? You spend time talking about issues that maybe kids have or that exist within the family, having those important conversations and really having sort of open lines of communication within your family, and dads engaging in that open communication as well. A third piece is what we call, and only academics can come up with a term like this, but we call it positive control. What positive control means that when your kids misbehave, you engage with that misbehavior in developmentally appropriate and beneficial ways. Everything from timeout to extra chores to really sitting down and talking with children about their misbehavior, what the consequences of that misbehavior might be, and really reasoning with them in a developmentally appropriate way about how they need to change their behaviors. And then the last piece is what we call just caregiving, which is engaging in developmentally appropriate physical care of children, whether that's helping them get food, to changing diapers, or helping them go to the washroom, or bathing and bedtime routines and all of that. So those are the elements that we really look at to see like how highly involved and engaged dads are at home and in the lives of their kids.
And so just kind of synthesizing with what we've talked about earlier, what are some of the effects you notice about the rates of depression or like masculine norm adherence and how that affects a father's ability to respond to those? I know that's a lot of different factors, so just anything you've got helps.
So depression's sort of an interesting one, right? So depression really interacts with what our expectations are around parenting. So
interesting.
This is I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there, but it's going to be a little bit long-winded.
Please go for it.
So when we look at the effect of depression in moms, what we notice is that moms are less warm and less emotionally supportive, but still engage in caregiving. When we look at dads, they just disengage from everything if they're depressed. And that's because, like we talked about at the beginning, we just don't have those same expectations of dads that we have of moms. What's interesting is when we look at the effect of depression in other places. So we're not just looking at the United States, but we're looking at other countries. And how does that influence fathering in those places? What we notice is that the dads are disengaging from warm behavior, from emotional support, from positive control, those sorts of things, but they're still engaging in caregiving in the same way that we see that happening among American moms here. And so what that tells us is that depression interacts with social expectations. If there's an expectation that dads are primarily breadwinners, then that's where they're going to put their efforts and their energies if they're feeling depressed or having psychological distress. In places where there's an expectation or stronger expectation that dads will engage in caregiving, they're more likely to put their energies in caregiving even when they're depressed. So there's a social component to depression that we don't often think about or talk about. We often talk about depression really as this physiological, biological response, but our psychology interacts with our sociology to influence how we behave. So that's the impact of depression. When we look at masculinity, what we have noticed in the research that we've done is that masculinity, what it really does is it dampens the likelihood of having norms and attitudes that you think that fathers matter for the development and well-being of children.
Interesting. And I believe in your research, you've also found that, fathers who are more emotionally supportive and provide more of that emotional warmth have more emotionally intelligent children, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Which is
that's
really
right.
cool.
Yeah. So, yeah. So they're modeling, right? That's like classic modeling behavior.
Yeah. So we've talked about kind of fatherhood and the mental health. We've talked about like kind of family dynamics, and now we can kind of get a little bit more into the policy of it all, which is something I'm very excited about as a former political science major. So yeah, I love getting into this stuff. But yeah, I read through your op-ed again for the Deseret News. I believe this is another one. It was Biden's American Families Plan will update the U.S.'s outdated family policy. So I'd love to hear what aspects of his plan stand out to you and what impact you think they could have on U.S. families.
Yeah, so it's a very,
big
very
bill, or it's a big proposal.
It's a huge bill. Yeah, so when we're just narrowing in on the family things, I think it's several things. Number one, I think the biggest piece of that puzzle for us is that the plan includes guaranteed paid family leave for the first time in the United States. I think it's really, really critical to note how outside the mainstream the United States is when it comes to this issue. The US is the only rich country in the world and only one of 5 countries in the entire world that do not have guaranteed paid maternity leave, right? So we don't have guaranteed paid leave for working moms in the United States. When we talk about paternity leave, right? So we are now the only rich country in the world that doesn't have paid paternity leave. Switzerland was the only other country. Their bill went into effect in January of this year that gave paid paternity leave as well. So the US is way outside the mainstream. This bill addresses that, right? So it guarantees 12 weeks of paid family leave. The second thing that I think is really, really huge and significant in this bill is something that's actually going to start this month, which is the extended and expanded child tax credits.
I'm very excited about that one. I've done some reading. I love that.
Yes. Yeah. So this is a really, really big change. So historically in the United States, we've given tax credits for children, but they come once a year and they come as part of your tax return. Now, starting this month for the rest of the year, and if the bill gets passed, then this will become the regular pattern in the United States. But half of that money will be delivered monthly to families. So, for example, I have 4 kids. We'll get $1,000 a month starting this month through December.
Wow.
Other countries have done that, right? So Canada, I think, is the best example of this. They have what's called the Canada Child Benefit. What that bill did in Canada, what that program did in Canada, I should say, is it reduced child poverty in Canada by 50%.
Wow.
That's a
insane.
monumental change. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
monumental change for many, many families, particularly working class families and low income families. $250 a month per child is a big deal. That's a big amount of money. And that money was getting spent in Canada, by the way, on things like diapers and food and sort of very basic necessities.
Mm-hmm.
The same, people have done a policy analysis of that here in the United States. What would the impact be if we just rearranged when we were paying out the benefit? And the answer is it would reduce child poverty in the United States by 40%.
It's
So
incredible.
That's huge, right? Like, and so that's just a little bit of a change in when people get their payments, but it has all kinds of effects on how people live their lives and the benefits that they can get from the tax benefit. So to me, that is a really, really enormous part of the bill that really could have wide-ranging effects on child well-being and family well-being, because we know that families, the biggest family stress that exists is financial stress. And so if there's ways to reduce that financial stress, then this is kind of a really good program to do it, and benefits in a way, by the way, that tends to be pretty well received across the ideological spectrum. So tax credits.
Mitt Romney kind of proposed something similar to this, right?
He did. Yeah, exactly. So tax credits tend to be pretty popular in the United States, and that's exactly how this plan delivers it. So
yeah, and that's I don't know. I feel like something that's been in the national discourse a bit in the last month or two is the declining birth rate in the U.S. and they thought there might be a baby boom during the pandemic, but it kind of ended up being a baby bust. And to me, like when I talk to millennials, most of the time the reason that they say they haven't started a family is because they don't think they can afford it. So it seems like a child tax credit is a great way to, help. It'll boost the economy too. When you have like a stronger workforce, a younger workforce, it just seems like an all-around win-win. So I'm all for expanding the social safety net in the U.S.
The two best ways to increase the fertility rate is to give people time and to give people money. Like those are the two best ways that we can do it, right? And so if people think that they can afford, it's not that they don't want to have children. Like I think there's this just like, well, people don't want to have kids anymore. It's just like the evidence is not there for that. People still want to have children, but you're exactly right. The problem is that it's really expensive to have children. The way that I would say it is, we have a lot of rhetoric around family values in the United States, but almost nothing in our policies back up that rhetoric. So have kids, but good luck tends to be what our policy perspective is.
Yeah.
There are things that we can do within social policy and even within existing social policies that really would benefit families and really strengthen families in really, really significant ways. And they're relatively low cost solutions. To me, this is an absolute win-win. And a lot of these policies, just to draw it back to what we were talking about earlier, but a lot of these policies that the president is proposing, they look exactly like the policies in Canada. So I think these are really beneficial, and we can look to our Canadian neighbors to see what the effects would probably be here in the U.S.
I can't get rid of the fact in my head that paternity leave in the U.S. is mostly just like a week, and it seems like we're socializing fathers to not be there for their children from the minute they're born. It's like for a mother, you need to have like a month, or I don't know what the average length is, but I know it's shorter in the US than other countries. But for a man, it's literally just 1 week, and then you're expected to go back like nothing has changed in your life, but you've brought a human being into the world.
And that's for men who have that opportunity, right? Which tend to be professional, middle-class men who work for large corporations. I've had this conversation a lot, and one of the things that people bring up is, hey, this is going to hurt businesses. There's no evidence that that's true. In fact, at worst, it's neutral. At best, it's actually beneficial to companies, because what ends up happening, particularly among moms, is you have highly educated, well-trained, established workers in jobs. They have children, and because there are no social supports, they end up leaving the workforce or going to part-time work. And by doing so, they leave their employer.
Yeah.
Employer turnover is a huge cost to companies, right? And so, or employee turnover is a huge cost to companies. Really, the costs that it would take to companies to implement these kinds of policies is less than what it would cost in turnover alone, right? And in lost productivity, because we know that workers who come back after leave are highly productive workers.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So think about that dad who's going back after a week of work, or a week off work, exhausted, not all there, thinking about what's happening at home, missing their child, missing their spouse. All of these things, right, are sucking productivity out of that employee, as opposed to giving them 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks and then coming back much more productive, well rested, ready to go, ready to work again. It's sort of an interesting dynamic, but
it really is.
It's positive for businesses. And I can, the best piece of evidence I can give you for why it is positive for businesses are companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple, all implementing these policies in the last couple of years. And Amazon, these aren't companies that do things out of the goodness of their heart. They do it because it's good for their bottom line. What big companies are recognizing is family leave is good for our bottom line, and happy workers are productive workers. And that means if we can offer this policy to people when they have children, then it's ultimately going to be good for our company as well.
Yeah. And happy workers are loyal workers too. It's like
That's
a happy
right,
worker. Someone knows they're going to get 3 weeks off for paternity leave. I think they're a lot more likely to stay at the job than they would be to, be like hunting around for a new one every 3-4 years.
That's right. Yeah. This is a company that values me. It values my family.
Exactly.
That's the message it sends. Yep.
Oh, I love this so much, and I want to do like a 5-part series with you about this, but we'll talk about that at another time. So I guess to kind of close it up, I wanted to we end all of our episodes by asking our guests how they measure success in their lives. So I kind of wanted to ask it through the lens of what you do, which is like, what does success mean to you, and how do you measure it in your own life? But also, how has your research shaped kind of your view of being a father? How does it inform you as a father yourself? So a little bit of a blend.
Yeah. So the latter first.
Okay.
I would say, so a lot of people ask me, oh, are you a better dad because you study this? And I think the answer is probably no. It just makes me feel more guilty about my shortcomings as a father.
I could imagine that.
Better.
I feel like all of the rule, what should be. Yeah, no, I get that.
And I still fall into pitfalls, right? But because parenting is hard, but joyful but hard. In terms of how do I measure success, man, I think it's a couple of things. So one is I measure success in terms of, do I feel like I've made a difference today? So did I make a difference in the life of a student? Did I make a difference in the life of an individual? Did I potentially make a difference in the life of somebody who was struggling with something, and something that I have done or written or whatever gave them some boost? Or did it help contribute to a conversation about the things that we've been talking about today? But also, I think success is really measured in the long term. A lot of, for me as a parent, a lot of days I don't feel successful. When I will know I'm successful is down the road. So, in 5, 7, 10, 20 years, looking at my children's lives and how they've ended up. Are they happy? Are they healthy? Do they have families of their own? Are they living a life that they want to live? That will tell me if I was successful. in this, and that can be a little bit disappointing because everybody loves instant gratification.
Yes.
But that's I think that's how I'll know success. So that's how I measure short-term and long-term success.
Well, I want to say you have made a difference in my life today, and in the long term, we'll see if you made a difference in our listenership. No, I'm just kidding. That was a joke. But before we go, I just want to say thank you again so much for coming on, Professor Shafer.
Thanks, Grant. I appreciate it.
And thank you to our audience for listening. We will see you all next week. That's it for now.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.